Buonasera, good evening everybody, and welcome to Casa Italiana Zerilli-Marimò. My name is Eugenio Refini, I'm the chair of the Department of Italian Studies, tonight marks the fourth and final event in the second installment of the John Freccero lecture series, which we started last year. As we are glad to acknowledge on each of these occasions, the series is made possible by the enduring collaboration between the Department of Italian Studies and Casa Italiana, whose director, Stefano Albertini, I warmly thank for his continuous support to our joint initiatives. But above all, this series is made possible by the extraordinary gift we received from the late Dr. Thomas Bellezza and Mr. John Jensen. They were dear friends to us all and very much missed. Their legacy is something which we cherish deeply, all the more so this evening, as our lecture concerns an author, Dante, whom Tom and John loved with particular devotion, not least because of their personal friendship with Professor Freccero and their experience of his Dante seminars. So I'm sure they would be very happy to know that we are dealing with Dante once again tonight here at Casa Italiana. And it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, a colleague I have long admired as a model not only of scholarly excellence but also of intellectual generosity, kindness and grace, all qualities much needed, I think, these days more than ever. Eleonora Stoppino, who is associate professor and interim head of the Department of Department of French and Italian at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She studied in Italy at the University of Pavia, then she pursued graduate work at the universities of Barcelona, Oregon, and finally UC Berkeley, where she earned her PhD in Italian and medieval studies. Her scholarship spans the literature and culture of the Middle Ages and the early modern period, with particular focus on epic and romance, early modern travel narratives, conduct texts, gender studies, and animal studies. Rooted in the rigorous tradition of the Italian Filologia Romanza, she ranges with equal fluency across the geographies of the Mediterranean, Italy, Provence, France, Spain, Catalonia, you name it. Among her many publications, I would like to just highlight her monograph, Genealogies of Fiction, Women Warriors and the Dynastic Imagination in the Orlando Furioso, which came out with Fordham University Press in 2011, which was a pioneering work in its bridging of historical and philological scholarship, theoretical inquiry and gender studies within the broader field of pre-modern Italian literary studies. Her other books include Performing Homer, The Voyage of Ulysses from Epic to Opera, co-edited with another friend of ours at Casa Italiana, Wendy Heller, professor at Princeton, and Libri Cavallereschi in Prosa in Versi, co-authored with Anna Maria Montanari. Eleonora Stoppino's forthcoming monograph, to which tonight's lecture is directly connected, explores animals, education, and contagion in medieval and early modern literature. It talks about Dante, not only about Dante, and of course during the Q&As, if you are curious to hear more about this book project, I'm sure Professor Stoppino will be happy to talk about it. The title for the talk tonight is Deforming Deceit, Contagion, Animality, and Metamorphosis in Inferno XXIX-XXX. So please join me in welcoming Professor Eleonora Stoppino.
Thank you, Eugenio. Grazie. As always, too generous, you know. Eugenio, I wish my mom was here. It is such a pleasure to be here tonight. I would like to thank the Department of Italian Studies, the Casa Italiana Zerilli-Marimò, Eugenio Refini, of course, my colleagues, Alison Cornish, Ara Merjan, Ida Cayazza, all the colleagues in the department, Director Albertini, the graduate students, Usame Gunes, who helped me make it here and be fantastically lodged. I am particularly honored to be here for a Freccero lecture. I met John Freccero via email many years ago when, for reasons that had nothing to do with him or me, I couldn't study with him, but he being the generous and immensely erudite person he was, guided me through my years in the US from afar. And I had then a fantastic lunch with him in Florence, and we talked about fashion and Dante always. So I couldn't be happier and more honored than to be here with you tonight in his name. And thank you all for coming out tonight. I will speak about the deforming illnesses. What a topic for Tuesday night. Look at us go. That plague the falsifiers in cantos 29 and 30 of Dante Alighieri's Inferno, where bodily corruption becomes a visible trace of moral deception. Those who falsified substances, identities, and natures are themselves deformed, their bodies registering the violence done to the natural order. Through a close analysis of these cantos and their lexicon, it is possible, I think, to reconstruct a dense semantic field of illness, contagion, and animality, tracing its roots to Ovidian texts and their medieval circulation. Read against these sources, Dante's language reveals a striking overlap between contagion and the non-human. Disease repeatedly draws bodies toward animality, eroding the boundaries between human and beast. And to start us off, I will ask, what is contagion? Contagion is literally contact. From the Latin cum and tangere, or tagere, it defines the implications and consequences of touch. One of the first occurrences of the word in medieval Italian appears in the vernacular rendition of Ovid's Remedia Amoris, copied in the Pisa area in the second half of the 14th century. And it is, Alison Cornish has studied these volgarizzamenti and especially how the volgarizzatori co-opt Dante into their midst. So it's a great honor to be here talking about that. And Dante resists this co-opting, I think. So, contagion. Or ricadde, secondo che addiviene tra i desiderosi amanti, e l'amor ripigliò gli spiedi che eran caduti. Da Remedia Mori, you have to love it. Chiunque tu sei che ami e non vorresti, fa che schifi li contagi, però che quelli sogliono nuocere e zian Dio alle pecore. Gli occhi, mirando gli occhi, sono offesi, e molte cose nocciono ai corpi per appiccamento. Love is here described as a form of contagion, which derives from contact. I'm translating appiccamento as conjunction or touch, trying to stay faithful to the etymological meaning of adpiccare. In the verb, the use of pit to connect two items gives rise to the meaning of attaching. It is clear that contagi and appiccare in the Pisan Remedia convey the same idea, to touch with consequences. In the commentary to the same passage, the meaning of contagion, equal to contact, shifts in the direction of what will become our usage, contamination, contagion. Quote, contagi sono usare e trafficare cosa sana con corrotta. Contagi means to have an interaction between something healthy and something corrupted. For the commentator, whose text follows closely the composition of the vernacular Remedia, contagion is the corruption of a healthy substance through the contact with one that is unhealthy. We will try to see tonight how crucial the circulation of Ovidian texts is to the construction of narratives of contagion in the Italian Middle Ages and to Dante's own imagination. For now, let me just point out how in this occurrence of the term contagio in the Italian language, we can witness not only the semantic slippage from contact to contagion, but also the appearance of the non-human animal in the description of the event. Not even sheep are immune from the dangerous consequences of touching. It is as if contagion irresistibly attracted non-human presences. This talk hopefully will track this phenomenon across two cantos of Dante's Commedia, highlighting the poetic cross-fertilization of the semantic spheres of animality, contagion, and illness. To give further context on the semantic sphere of contagion, at the time Dante writes his poem, Jacopone da Todi, roughly contemporary of Dante, he dies in 1306, uses contagione with the meaning of contamination of something pure. And the adjective contagioso is consistently used by contemporary to indicate the spreading of illnesses. Both Villani and the Ottimo Commento use it in this sense. On Contagion, De Contagione, is the title of the text that closes my book, the book Eugenio kindly mentioned. This is a treatise on epidemics by the Veronese physician Girolamo Fracastoro, published in 1546. It is the circular discourse on the presence of the non-human in life that propels, I argue, the process that leads Fracastoro to hypothesize that contagion is not a quality of the air, like Galen thought and proposed, but rather an animal process, where seminaria, that's the central keyword of Fracastoro's Contagion, seminaria carry the illness from one body to the other. To further probe the irresistible attraction between contagion and the non-human, and to assess how these two elements together contribute to the epistemological shift that will eventually lead to the scientific conception of contagion in medicine, I propose a reading of two cantos from Dante's Commedia that highlights the peculiar relationship between animal and contagion. There may be objections to this approach. The first being that these are comedic cantos. The presence of the non-human serves primarily to debase the portrayal of humans. It is certainly true and quite apparent in these cantos that one of the central strategies of dehumanization in the Commedia is the use of animal metaphors, similes, and tropes. However, recent studies, particularly those focusing on this portion of hell and its depiction of animality, tend to highlight the pervasive presence of non-human animals of various kinds. The non-humans themselves, not just the use of them to portray humans and debase them. And these studies are beginning to show that there is more to the animal presence than mere comedy and debasement, and that the non-human presence itself transcends a generic other-than-human qualifier. Giuseppe Ledda, in particular, has argued in favor of a more nuanced approach to the animal presences in these cantos and in the Commedia more broadly. In my analysis of these cantos, I further argue that the combined portrayal of contagion and animality requires, for a fuller understanding, the discovery of a more precise textual and socio-historical context. In Contagion, I argue specific kinds of non-humanity are conjured, specific non-humans evoked. This points us toward a distinct knowledge of the non-human, one that can be fully grasped in the moments of identity shifting that the fear of contagion invokes. And this is where the nexus between contagion and animality really takes shape, I think, in these cantos. In other words, the portrayal of contagion triggers a specific toolbox of animality, a set of tropes and representations that refer to a particular incarnation of the human-non-human distinction. Let us return to the Commedia and to Canto 29 in particular. Dante and Virgil, you remember, are entering the final pocket of the 8th circle, divided into 10 evil pockets, the 10 malebolge, each housing a different kind of fraudulent sinner. They have just passed through the bolgia of the sowers of discord, encountered the prophet Mahomet, and witnessed the poet Bertrand de Born define contrappasso, Dante's dispositif of justice, or one of his dispositives of justice. The final bolgia is reserved for the falsifiers, those who counterfeited either nature or their person, coins or words. Dante categorizes 4 types of sinners among the falsifiers: alchemists, impersonators, counterfeiters, and false witnesses. From the outset, the place is described as a hospital, drawing on specific knowledge of renowned locations in the peninsula and beyond, famous for their curative facilities. Qual dolor fora, se degli spedali di Val di Chiana tra luglio e settembre e di Maremma e di Sardegna i mali fossero in una fossa tutti insembre, tale era quivi, e tal puzzo ne usciva qual suol venir delle marcite membre. Noi discendemmo in su l'ultima riva del lungo scoglio, pur da man sinistra, e allor fu la mia vista più viva giù ver lo fondo, lave la ministra dell'alto sire infallibil giustizia punisce i falsador che qui registra. The translator, this is Derling Martinez, the translators are only a few steps ahead of the original text with the expression malarial ditch. However, the clever use of the adjective malarial, which is etymologically connected to the Italian bad air, malaria, steers the modern reader in the direction of the malarial illness. In other words, the word malarial refers for us to the specific illness, whereas the contemporary reader would have perceived a general reference to bad air, puzzo, ditch, the bad air, the corrupting miasma that, for Galenic theories of contagion, carries contagion. The combination of stench, puzzo, ditch, fossa, and rotten limbs, marcite membra, instead sets the scene for the pestilence evoked in the next lines, keeping the description more in line with the depiction of the plague. On the one hand, the malaria refers to a more general conception of how contagion works through air. On the other, the depiction of the ditch points to a more specific illness, the plague, or at least in this case, the plague of Aegina, described by Ovid. And to be completely honest with you, one of the things that interests me the most is how Dante is providing a head language of contagion that the medical profession will borrow and use and transform, and then in turns become part of a medical discourse. But when we read it today, we attach to it meanings that were not necessarily there etymologically. However, part of my argument is that Dante's poetic realization prepares the words for something to come. Dante depicts the scene, the plague of the falsifiers has been noted using 2 sets of epidemic knowledge. One reflects the contemporary presence of medical institutions designed to heal the body, Val di Chiana, etc., and the other comes from Ovid's description in the Metamorphosis of the plague that struck the island of Aegina. Dante renders this passage as follows. I'm going to skip over that. Non credo che a veder maggior tristizia fosse in Aegina il popol tutto infermo, quando fu l'aere si pien di malizia, che gli animali, infino al picciol vermo, cascaron tutti, e poi le genti antiche, secondo che i poeti hanno per fermo, si ristorar di seme di formiche, che era veder per quella oscura valle languir gli spiriti per diverse biche. The air back in Aegina was pien di malizia, full of malice, a clear reference to the corrupting air, again, and the Galenic theory of miasma that carries contagion. Dante recounts here for the second time the episode of the plague of Aegina, which he had already described in the Convivio, focusing on different elements, and I won't dwell on that, but suffice it to say that the element of air corruption is present in Convivio too. What I want to focus on here, however, is the episode of the metamorphosis of ants into human beings to save the population of Aegina, which is part of a web of references to Ovidian texts that supports the connection between animals and contagion. Commentators have recognized long ago, Contini more than anyone else, how important Ovid is to these cantos. So I'm not discovering anything when I talk about the pervasive presence of Ovid here. Dante's rewriting of the Ovidian rebirth of humans from ants has been read in the framework of the failure of Ovid's art to realize the true Christian metamorphosis. Barorini, for instance, has argued that this is a failed Ovidian metamorphosis, Dante recounts. While agreeing with this assessment, I would like to focus on the apparently trivial detail, minuscule detail, of the picciol vermo. Vermo here is translated as worm, but in Tuscan usage of the time, it is really a minuscule living non-human. Critics have disagreed on, this is what makes Dante scholarship so much fun, on the inclusion or exclusion of the picciol vermo in the destruction of the population of Aegina. And everything hinges on the interpretation of infino, right? Does the vermo survive? Does contagion stop at the vermo, or is the vermo part of the spreading of contagion? And it seems irrelevant, but I think it is quite relevant. Ledda has argued, I think persuasively, that the expression infino means that the contagion does not affect the ants, the insects, hence their ability to be turned into humans and recreate the Myrmidonian people, which is the Ovidian metamorphosis, right? From ants, there's the recreation of people, a sort of second Deucalion and Pyrrha recreation of beings. What is really interesting is that the language of inclusion and exclusion is very frequently present in texts that describe contagion. There is often a group that is excluded from it. We lived through a pandemic, so you all remember that there were categories who were perhaps less affected. Are women less prone to COVID than men? Is there a group that is immune? Are cats passible of contagion? The discourse on contagion triggers this exclusionary, inclusive language. In this case, ants survive, apparently because of their minuscule size. Two elements are crucial to these categorizations. First, they are precisely this, categorizations that establish distinctions between species, thereby reinforcing them, human, non-human, potentially all living creatures versus insects. Secondly, these categorizations are often controversial, as in the case of infine al piccol vermo. And the grammatical element of inclusion-exclusion, this happens in Fracastoro's on Contagion as well, and there's debate about it. The grammatical element of inclusion-exclusion can be read, has been read differently to indicate both exclusion and inclusion of a category. Let us return to Dante's setting of the scene, which places us squarely in the realm of contagion. The plague of Aegina frames the episode in such terms, and additionally, it provides us with an important clue about the perception of illness spreading. For Dante, in Ovid, the smallest of beings seem immune to contagion, and are therefore the starting point for new life. This we could call in nuce immunitarian theory of the smallest, where the smallest is immune to contagion, is particularly interesting when we consider the conception that Fracastoro will later propose in the 16th century in his largely unsuccessful attempt to challenge Galenic theory. No one listens to him, but he was nonetheless a genius. Fracastoro speaks of seminaria, minuscule particles that carry contagion. Dante speaks of seme di formiche. Naturally, I do not mean to put the two expressions on the same level or even to suggest that they have similar meanings. It is clear that they evoke different principles. A living vector of contagion in the case of Fracastoro, and the smallest living creature, a reproductive principle in the case of Dante. Nonetheless, the reference to a living, non-human animal being in both cases suggests an underlying reflection, albeit from very different perspectives, on the smallest particles of the chain of life as living, not as inert matter. This contagious opening on Aegina directs our reading of the depictions of sinners and their punishments. It has not been noted before that all categories of sinners can be read as affected by contagious elements, all but the final one. The alchemists, those who falsified nature, have a skin condition considered contagious. The impersonators have a condition that resembles closely to rabies. The false witnesses have a contagious fever. The counterfeiters, or at least their most apparent representative, have dropsy, not contagious. I will return later to the specific features of this ailment. Let us consider for now the various contagious illnesses and their animal connections. The sinner's non-human qualities are easy to see as they lay cadaver-like or beast-like on each other, an image that I will return to in a moment. Qual sovra il ventre e qual sovra le spalle l'un dell'altro giacea, e qual carpone si trasmutava per lo tristo calle. Passo passo andavam senza sermone, guardando e ascoltando gli ammalati che non potean levar le lor persone. Io vedi due sedere a sé poggiati, come a scaldar si poggia teghia teghia, dal capo al piè di schianze macolati. The souls portrayed through their limbs, parcellized, ventre, spalle, are laying on each other or moving on four legs, carpone. This dehumanization is amplified through the use of an object simile. They are literally like things, pans, set to warm, teghia, teghia. And the schianze that cover them are illness-derived scabs. The term macolati Dante uses derives from the Latin macula, literally stain. Even though in early Italian this term has moral connotation, Dante himself uses it for the quintessential beast of his poem, the lonza, as you all remember, che di pel macolato era coverta. These lines start to weave together the fabric of illness and animality. The specificity of this form of dehumanization is attested in the manuscript reception of the poem. This is the Holcomb manuscript Genoese production, early 14th century. We see the sinners presented in a cannibalistic act, clearly connotated as non-human, at the same time both clearly sick and animalized. And there is this illumination from the Bestiaire d'Amour, fairly contemporary, that I think it's a bestiary, but it's a bestiaire d'amour, which is the weirdest bestiary, that's a technical term, ever produced, that gives us really the sense of the kinds of images that are being used to portray lion with prey or sinner with sinner. Here, the importance of the dichotomy between surface and substance, on which I cannot dwell in the interest of time, is emphasized in this and other manuscripts to the repeated focus on the representation of skin in the punishment of these souls, which again goes along with the term macula, maculato, that Dante uses. Furthermore, the actions of the damned who madly scratch themselves are inscribed in two animalistic similes, ones that posit the sinner in the object position of the animal being scrubbed or scaled. Qual sovra il ventre e qual sovra le spalle... No, I already read that. Excuse me. E non vidi già mai menare stregghia a ragazzo aspettato dal segnorso, né a colui che mal volontier vegghia, come ciascun menava spesso il morso dell'unghie sopra sé per la gran rabbia del pizzicor, che non ha più soccorso, e si traevan giù l'unghie la scabbia, come coltel di scardova le scaglie o d'altro pesce che più larghe l'abbia. The sinners become, in this imagined metamorphosis, the horse, evoked by the curry comb, and the bream, scardova, or other fish. Shortly thereafter, to reinforce the idea of contagion, one of the souls is described as a leper, onde l'altro lebroso, 39:124, and leper as lebroso functions in a system with the many occurrences of puzzo, we already saw one, stench, or even leppo, which recurs in these cantos and literally means the stench of burnt animal fat on a pan. The Holcomb manuscript depicts cannibalism in a way that it's easy to picture a lion or similar beast, as we saw, in the place of one of the sinners. Dante's text, however, moving in a different direction from what the illuminators will do, points the reader in another direction, a highly contagious one, that of rabies. And this is the text that depicts the scene in central position in the manuscript image. Ma né di Tebe furie né troiane si vider mai in alcun tanto crude, non punger bestie, non che membra umane, quanti io vidi in due ombre smorte e nude che mordendo correvan di quel modo che il porco quando del porcil si schiude. L'una giunse a capocchio e in sul nodo del collo l'assannò, sì che tirando grattarli fece il ventre a fondo sodo. E la retin che rimase tremando mi disse quel folletto è Gianni Schicchi e va rabbioso altrui così conciando. The human-non-human distinction in this scene is thematized from the very first tercet. And then the souls are animalized through the use of pigs. Correvan di quel modo che il porco quando del porcil si schiude. Now, pigs, the reference to pigs triggers a series of, the choice of pigs triggers a series of references. You will all remember that, I am obsessed with this, perhaps you don't remember it. In the introduction to the Decameron, one of the moments of terrifying contagion of the plague is when pigs, by putting their snouts into dead people's clothes, contract contagion. So, in a Borgesian move, I'm now asking you to think of the pigs in Boccaccio's Plague and read them back to Dante here. But there's also the evangelical episode of the possessed man that Jesus saves by sending the demons into pigs. This is Matthew 8:28-32. Jesus sends demons into pigs. Further emphasized or systematized by the use of assanno, which is literally, as the translator rightly does, setting, he set its tasks in him. The vocabulary remains consistently animalistic. The terms rabbia, rabbioso, rabid, rabies appear 6 times in these 2 cantos, and only once in reference to a soul who's not an impersonator. It seems plausible that the contrappasso that Dante has devised for his impersonators is a nature-changing illness that, as known from ancient times, spreads through non-human contact or contagion. Rabies and its ability to cross borders between species were well known throughout the Middle Ages, and classical medical sources such as Pliny the Elder, Silius Aurelianus, among others, had left a wealth of prescriptions on how to prevent contagion, including the sort of first attempt to conceive of an antidote that is based on immunization. The cure was suggested was take some hair from the dog and sew it in the wound of the, from which, maybe is just my passion, the expression hair of the dog that bit me, then used for addiction and again, often in the case of scientific or parascientific thinking, sometimes words go beyond what is the effective science of the times. And I think these are such cases. But the final and most famous sinner of this diptych of cantos, Master Adam, destroys my neat, or not very neat, progress of contagion, because Master Adam has nothing to do with animals or contagion. He's plagued by dropsy, hydropisia, a terrible bloating of the body, coupled with insufferable and unsatiable thirst. E poi che 2 rabbiosi fuor passati, sovra cui avevo l'occhio tenuto, you see the rabbiosi again, rivolsilo a guardar gli altri malnati. Io vidi un, fatta a guisa di leuto, purché gli avesse avuta l'anguinaia tronca dall'altro che l'uomo ha forcuto. La gravi tropesì, che si dispaia le membra con l'omor che mal converte, che il viso non risponde alla ventraia, faceva lui tener le labbra aperte come l'etico fa, che per la sete l'un verso il mento e l'altro in sul rinverte. The depiction of the sinner insists on his transformation into an object, a lute. As we have already seen with the alchemists in Canto 29, such objectifications, the pan, the scab, blur the line between the human, the animal, and the inanimate, creating a continuum of degraded forms. In this case, the process is underscored by Dante's choice of terms like tronca, truncated, and forcuto, bifurcated, words often associated with animals and plants rather than humans. Dante refers to humoral theory, for which dropsy is understood as an imbalance of bodily humors, specifically an excess of phlegm and water, l'umor che mal converte. This in turn produces a non-correspondence between body and face. Il viso non risponde alla ventraia, thus insisting on the mismatched nature of his disfigured body. In addition to these non-human elements, what calls our attention is the word anguinaia, the corresponding of the English groin, or better to preserve etymology, inguinal area. This is an extremely rare word in medieval Italian. And one of them is here. Another is in Boccaccio, Contagion, but let's not go there because it's in the future. Another, also in the future, but a much nearer future, is a Florentine commentary to Ovid's Arsamandi, where it is used to describe Scylla. La figliola di Niso, la quale involò I capelli porporini al padre, cadendo dalla poppa della nave, si dice che fu fatta uccello. Quella Silva riceve dal padre infino che I debiti della madre. Ella strigne nell'anguinaia rabbiosi cani. We see here an unexpected connection between the bloated belly of Master Adam, the counterfeiter, and a non-human monstrous pregnancy that involves rabid dogs, that of Scylla. Scylla is an ambiguous figure, to say the least, deeply linked in the Metamorphosis to a dual nature and marked by hybridity. There are, in fact, two different Scyllas in the Ovidian text, often confused in later traditions. One Scylla was the daughter of Nisus, king of Megara, when Minos, king of Crete, invaded Greece to avenge the death of his son Androgeos and laid siege to the city of Nysa. Scylla, having fallen in love with Minos, I don't have to remind you of the really hybrid, non-human nature of that island over there, but back to Scylla, betrayed her father and caused his death by cutting from his head the magical golden, in some versions purple, lock of hair that ensured his life. After using Scylla to capture the enemy cities of Megara and Nysa, Minos ordered the Cretans to cast the guilty woman into the sea. Her body, carried by the waves, was washed up on a promontory, which, according to Pausanias and Strabo, took its name from her. There is another Scylla, the sea monster who looms menacingly on the Calabrian side of the Strait of Messina, threatening ships that dare cross these perilous water, devouring anything that comes within her reach. In Ovid's version, this Scylla, while still an innocent girl, is courted by Glaucus, a sea deity, but she proudly rejects his advances. Spurned, Glaucus turns to the sorceress Circe, begging her to make Scylla return his love with equal passion. But that's a terrible idea. Circe herself has fallen for Glaucus and counsels him to scorn the one who has scorned him. When Glaucus refuses her love, Circe, jealous and vengeful, casts a magical potion into the pool where Scylla bathes, and as a result, Scylla is transformed into a hideous monster, woman only to the waist, from which savage, barking dogs emerge. And in the medieval reception of Scylla and Glaucus, we have, as it often happens, a wide array. Here, she's there, bathing quietly with these quite tame dogs spurring from her anguinaia, one would say. Glaucus is just there completely human in awe. In this version, they are both completely deprived of any non-human feature. But in versions like this, we have this quite stunning, neat parallel between the sea creature god Glaucus and the rabid dog gird Scylla. It is possible that Dante, influenced by Ovid, connected the rabid impersonators with the hysterical pregnancy of Master Adam. And here what I'm focusing on is the extreme lexical consistency of rabies and rabid in cantos 29 and 30, leading to the potential memory of Scylla. We do not know whether Dante may have had Scylla in mind, and as he depicted Master Adam. His body, I completely concede, is objectified and not animalized. Its description ending precisely at the Anguinaia, where the hybrid bodies of Scylla and Glaucus reveal their dual nature. What we could hypothesize, however, is that the Ovidian semantic field of contagion and hybridity, its connection with the desire for and fear of another nature, influenced the poet of the Commedia regardless of his intention, that the irresistible attraction between human bodies that change at the groin and their non-human counterparts is present here as an Ovidian echo in the cantos of those who tampered with nature. What is more, it is present, it's consistent with the vocabulary of the Tuscan volgarizzamenti, which, while most likely composed after Dante wrote the Commedia, are notoriously connected with the cultural background of Boccaccio and reflection on illness. This demonstrates a tight connection with the Tuscan circulation of Ovid and its influence over the vocabulary of animality and contagion. Finally, there is in this canti a gesture towards the mythological depiction of the experience of another nature, embodied in Paradiso 1 by none other than Scylla's rejected lover, Glaucus. In the Metamorphosis, it is by describing his own transformation, revitalized by Dante in Paradiso 1, that Glaucus at once justifies his hybrid aspect and champions the superiority of desiring another nature. Scylla admires his dual nature, quote, ultimaque excipiat quod tortilis inguina piscis, that he derives his final loins from curving fish. And she wonders whether he is human or monster. Glaucus senses this is Ovid, and tells his story. Once he was a human, a fisherman, and he found an herb that revived his caught fish. Curious, he ate it, and as soon as the juices touched his throat, he felt his heart begin to tremble within, and his breast was seized by a passion for another nature, alterius naturae, as he turned into a god. And Glaucus describing his metamorphosis deeply influences Dante's depiction of what it means to trasumanar in Paradiso 1. Beatrice tutta nelle eterne rote fissa con gli occhi stava, e io in lei le luci fissi di là su remote. Nel suo aspetto tal dentro mi fei, qual si fe Glauco, nel gustar dell'erba che il fe consorto in mar degli altri dei. Trasumanar, significar per verba non si poria, però l'esempio basti a cui esperienza grazia serba. Glaucus is, for Dante, Paradiso 1, the emblem of trasumanar, transcending the human, the emblem of accessing another nature. Ovid gives Dante not only the vocabulary and the images to portray the corrupted nature of the falsifiers. His work and its medieval tradition provide the author of the Commedia with a much more dangerous semantic field. It opens a space where humans and non-humans are in dangerous contact, contagione, if you will, a space where the possibility to acquire another nature is within reach, with all its potential, glaucus, but also with all its dangers, glaucus, but even more Scylla and others. So, to conclude, we could ask if I am at least marginally right, and there is a special connection between non-human animals and contagion in these cantos, why? What is the link between these two elements and these sinners besides dehumanization? And the answer, I think, may be in the nature of their sin. They falsified, distorted, reproduced, faked. As Capocchio, the alchemist, says, ma perché sappi chi si ti seconda contro i sanesi, sguzza verme l'occhio, sì che la faccia mia bien ti risponda, si vedrai ch'io sono l'ombra di Capocchio, che falsai i metalli con l'alchimia, che falsai li metalli con l'alchimia, e ti dei ricordar, se ben t'adocchio, com'io fui di natura, buona scimmia. Capocchio, the monkey, has mimicked reality. Through his ape-like imitation, he has corrupted the very fabric of the universe, straying from God's path. The monkey can become a symbol of dangerous imitation, of perverted education. Education requires imitation, but rejects mere mimicry. The gap between true imitation and species confusion, where matter is distorted and corrupted, is perilously small. Imitation and contagion are only a few inches, a few hairs, a few tusks apart. Thank you.
So we have, thank you very much, Nora, it was fantastic. And we have a microphone going around, so we have certainly time for questions.
Oh, it's
start. Well, I mean, I will just break the ice. Thank you, Nora. This was really, really beautiful. I was thinking a few things, and actually, I would like to ask you something. Really moving from the very end. I think I really enjoyed your way of closing and bringing together contagion and imitation, because of course, these two terms are so imbued with all sorts of implications, and I'm wondering whether you can expand a little bit on that. I mean, how do you see this, which is also kind of theoretical way of putting them together? Because you have traced this beautiful reading of the text in Dante, and your kind of very subtle analysis of these textual elements, which in most cases come from Ovid, there's no doubt about it, but then you're also suggesting that this kind of memory is bringing with it even more than just the text, and then kind of zooming out and seeing all these connections. And then, of course, I mean, I seem to see as a gesture there a connection between the way in which contagion works across bodies and the way in which imitation works across texts. And, because of course we can play with metaphor and say that the imitation, as, Dante does it reading Ovid, has to do also with really creating these contacts, right? And I'm wondering whether this is the direction in which you're playing with imitatio versus contagion is going, and if you can just say a little more about it, I'm very curious.
Thank you. That's a beautiful question, and you're absolutely right. I think the right term is I'm playing with it, because both contagion and imitation, I think, will be systematized as terms later than this, and potentially in similar ways, where the idea that imitation is can only be achieved in real art, otherwise it's mimicry, is of course, present in Dante, but it will be systematized in humanistic thinking much more precisely. And similarly, the idea that we can pass illnesses and that potentially that illnesses can move from humans to non-human, and heavens forbid, from non-humans to human, which is highly destabilizing of not only hierarchical idea of species, but of the basic tenets of what is human, again, happens much later. So what I'm playing with is really the lexicon of Contagion, and the idea that Dante, through Ovid, works with throughout the entire Commedia, of what it means to ascend to a different level of poetry, still taking, bringing along the supreme wonders of, for instance, the Ovidian Metamorphosis, and what happens with Glaucus in Paradiso 1, I think, is precisely that Ovidian imitation has turned into something completely superior, which is the divine experience, and so in the moment and in a moment that will in a poet like Dante, who will give so much language both to the vocabulary of Contagion and to the conception of imitation, it strikes me that the two things are happening, the two sort of sets of knowledge are brought together in a canto which is essentially about what it means to tamper with nature through an imitation that becomes a deformation of reality. And that doesn't answer your question, but...
Thank you, Nora. Very beautiful. You've got me thinking. I pay, as maybe a lot of people do, I pay a lot more attention to Master Adam than to the Rabbiosi. I mean, that whole Bolger just seems like a mishmash of like, oh yeah, let's throw these people all together. So there is something about, why? Like, what does the incestuous Mira have to do with the betrayer of the Trojan horse? And like, there's something problematic about categorization in this last thing, and the Bolge are sort of a filing cabinet. So, I think the key to it would be to figure out how Master Adam fits, right? And I think, again, because Glaucus is one of the first images in the Paradiso, it's like, oh, it's an image of divinity. And then when you really go back to the story, it's an image of monstrosity. And so why divinity and monstrosity are sort of the two extremes that the human can go to, right? I mean, that the hierarchy, I think, remains. And Master Adam, you were saying it's not dropsy is not contagious, but there is something about his sin of counterfeiting is a social problem. I don't know if contagion is quite the right word, but certainly the money gets into the system, the economic system of the society, and then inflation that's how I understand how his dropsy is related to his crime, that you have economic inflation, and so his belly extends out, and that Master Adam is what does he say? Debasing the currency. So it's a again, in a hierarchy, adding dross, right? Adding more base material to the coin. But what he's really doing is corrupting the image, and of course the image of God, which is man, right? Adam being his name and everything. So So I don't know. I guess I would push against it. Maybe I'll just put this as a challenge, because I think maybe the key is to figure out how he fits. But that instead of erasure of distinctions, I mean, it's transgression of those lines. Instead, it's a kind of like, right, reaffirming that there are distinctions, and yeah, if you transgress them towards to debasing, it's one thing, and if you go in the other direction, it's positive, but that the verticality remains. I don't know. That's what I was
Thank
thinking.
you. No, I completely agree with you, and I think and I really think it's about corruption, and I think that and you know, certainly not the first to say this, but I think that there is some value in pushing it. Pushing it towards Contagion, because Contagion for us has qualities or threats that I want to see. I want to see what's the configuration of Contagion that Dante can be pushed into. Not because I want Dante to be interested in Contagion, which I think he absolutely was not, but because I think that, as you said, there is this constant anxiety about the corruption of the currency, and that's portrays as an illness. It makes total sense. But once we have the animals, then there's a real threat. I agree with you that the hierarchy stays in place, but I think there's a renegotiation of what, or the threat of a renegotiation of positions. Meaning, what does it mean that I think that the episode of the pigs would trigger an evangelical memory. And what does it mean that demons can be sent into pigs if you take it to its extreme? So I completely agree with you. The hierarchy stays in place. I think it's helpful to me to try to see if contagion and corruption are precisely synonymous in these cantos, and I'm not sure. So I'm not answering your question, but you made me think more.
Good enough.
Thank you. That was really fascinating. I'm really interested in the concept of deformation, and I'm interested in what appears, to my eyes at least, to be kind of a twisting of how Aristotle understood the deformation here. If I'm not mistaken, for Aristotle, deformation is essentially about privation. Something is deformed if an entity lacks a characteristic that an entity of that kind is supposed to possess. And, he talks about biology, of course, that's something that he talks about at length in discussing animals in particular. And so I was wondering if you could really talk more about the topic of deformation, as it also features prominently in your title. Is Dante here, a orthodox Aristotelian? Is Dante deforming deformation? This is just an invitation for you to elaborate on the topic of deformation.
Thank you. That's a great question. And so, in Canto 13, Pier della Vigna, we have a human soul turned into a plant, and that seems an Aristotelian deformation. There's, you are you revert to a more to a lesser form of life because you have given up life, suicides, and so you are reduced to the vegetative soul. Then, of course, there's great contradiction with the representation of with the voice of what Pierre actually says and his memory, which is really interesting. But that seems, if I compare that to these cantos, I don't think Dante is very orthodox in his deformation. And that has to do with what Alison was saying of the corruption and what I just hinted at, which is the issue of skin. That when the representation of illness has to do with the surface, and so, scabies, skin conditions, and maybe that's a helpful way to think about it. When the corruption goes deeper and deeper, the deformation goes under the skin, goes deeper as well. So I think that I would actually say that that Dante is not being, and maybe that's also part of why we have so many issues with these cantos and with what. Or I do, and with what Master Adam is doing there. And I would think that no, he is moving beyond this this question of loss of quality that triggers a deformation. I think he's, yeah. Thank you. That's a great question.
Thank you. So as we were talking earlier, that I'm also interested in the human-animal divide, but I was struck by a particular thing, and I guess realistically this is not so much a question about Dante, because Dante would have likely taken this from Ovid, maybe more a question about an Ovidian interpretation, which is that the portrayal of Scylla is different from how I remember the Scylla of the Odyssey to have been shaped, which is that, if I'm recalling it, Edith Hamilton's mythology. I read that a long time ago. There was this illustration of Scylla with 9 heads, and the serpent part was her upper body, and it seems like that's the same, because you said there were 2, but that would have been on the Scylla of the Strait of Messina there, yes. And so here you've got now this lower body being the monstrous part, and so I'm curious if that was maybe an Ovidian choice, and perhaps if it's evocative in a particular way of something Ovid perhaps was trying to do, or if it maybe it predates Ovid, that distinction.
That's a great question too, and in that sense, that the most successful and productive image of Scylla is with rabid dogs at her, especially in the Middle Ages. And I think Virgil, Ovid, all depicting her like that. Dante does not mention the myth directly ever, just the straight ones. But I think in that sense, I don't want to make a horribly generalized claim on medieval hybrids or feminine hybrids, but there is a great tendency to focus on the lower body and the sexualized nature of these creatures. Which, I don't think it's a coincidence that there's this word anguinaia in the set of cantos that house Mirra. I think because in the lore, the sort of group of women who are sexually threatening and overall, that embody this sexual menace, Scylla, Mirra, often go together with others. So I would have to do more work. There's a beautiful book by a classicist, whose name, of course, now escapes me because it would be too beautiful to remember it. But it's a great book on the classical Scylla, and I'm sure she talks about that. Off the top of my head, the texts I am familiar with, and Dante's sources and the Volgarizzamenti all have her with the bottom part. So, thank you.
Any other questions? If not, can I add one before we close? Just it's actually stemming from what you just said in response to Andrea's question. Playing a little bit the devil's advocate. It is interesting that you brought up another example of the Pierre de la Vigne one, which of course is also very based on another kind of, of the auctores, which Dante is working on, right? I mean, that's Virgil and the Polydorus episode. And so I'm just wondering whether, this kind of, again, contagion, imitation sort of thing, it's easy to say that it runs across the Commedia because we know that Dante is kind of constantly working with sources, right, in a way. Of course, he does a lot more than just reusing them. But it seems to me that the idea of de formatio, as the case of Pierre de la Vigne embodies, kind of gives us something to think about in terms of what happens with the transformation of these sources, right? I mean, again, we're playing with the same terms which keep coming, and I think what you showed is really that it's not just about thinking in terms of transformation or metamorphosis, because some kind of metamorphosis happen through contagion, right? I mean, it's if you think about the etymology of the term and this idea of contact, there's something which gets affected through the process of being in touch. And so the actual question I want to get to is whether in your corpus is always contagion negative? I mean, do you have a sense where contagion and the lexicon of contagion may end up having positive results? Because what is interesting is that, for instance, in love sickness, the kind of malattia d'amore kind of tradition, of course, contagion comes up. And if you think about love as a form of sickness, inevitably we end up being in a negative framework. At the very same time, love is a very peculiar kind of thing, which is often celebrated even in terms of contagion. That contagious effects can be transformed into something positive. So I'm wondering whether in your corpus everything is bleak and dark and sickness-oriented for real, or do you see areas of ambiguity?
That's a great question, to which I wish I could answer, yes, there are examples of, this. But in my corpus, and that's why I think in my corpus, contagion, because it has to have contact and it moves away so quickly from the eye, for instance, there's this, and in the bestiaries there are examples of eye transmission, as in love, sickness. But the moment it becomes about contact, it goes very wrong. Which is why for me the counterpart is in this work is really education. It's really the process of learning from another being that could be very well a non-human being, or of an animal learning from a human. But there seems to be in the corpus I'm considering a real dichotomy between what will corrupt and what can teach. And animals are sort of, I can turn the question around and say that animals can do both. They can corrupt or be the emblem of corruption, and they can teach or be the emblem of a better kind of learning. But the bad one is contagion, and the good one is education, it seems. Right. Thank you.
Okay, so if we don't have any more questions, I would like to thank Eleonora Stoppino again for this beautiful talk.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And thank you all for joining.